Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, good evening for those joining from other time zones. Welcome and thank you for attending this EU Disinfo Labs webinar titled Who is Most Vulnerable to AI-Generated Mis and Disinformation, Psychological Drivers of Media Literacy and Belief in Harmful Online Content. My name is Raquel Miguel. I'm a senior researcher at EU Disinfo Lab, and I am happy to welcome our guest speaker today, Jason Potel, who will delve into one of the most obscure topics regarding disinformation, and more specifically regarding AI-generated disinformation, the psychological motivations behind believing and sharing this kind of content. But before I hand over the floor for people attending for the first time, let me briefly introduce EU Disinfo Lab, which is a non-profit organization that gathers knowledge and expertise on disinformation in Europe and supports the community. With that aim, we host a big annual conference that this year will take place in Vilnius next October. And just a quick reminder that the call for proposals for this conference is open already until the end of this month. You can find more information on our website or scanning the QR code you can see in the screen. Can we see the next slide, please? Yes, thank you so much. Don't miss the opportunity to attend. And with the same goal in mind, we host these webinars because we want to give visibility to the excellent work being done across the field, to share insights and to foster dialogue. It's also a way to create a resource hub for the community because all these webinars are recorded and available on our YouTube channel, including this one. A few practical notes. If you prefer to follow the conversation in your language, you can turn on live captions and the translation option following the instructions you can see on the screen. And if you want to interact in this webinar, please join Slido, because this is the tool we will use for the Q&A session that will take place after the speaker's presentation. You can open Slido on your phone using the QR code you can see on the screen, and alternatively, you can open slido.com in your web browser and enter the hashtag disinfo to join our space. And as usual, let's briefly practice how to use this tool by answering two questions. Please tell us where you are joining us from today and which sector you represent. First reply, Madrid, hello Madrid, Brussels, London, Slovakia, for now just Europe. Let's see if we have some participants from the other side, Israel, not just Europe. Okay, Rome, Helsinki, Lisbon, welcome everyone. Okay, Argentina, that's very far away. That's nice to have you here as well. Singapore, from the other side, United States, hello. Great, that is a good representation of the whole world. Maybe now we can have an overview of the sector that you represent. Most people are coming from civil society, NGOs, academia as well. Yeah, different sectors covered as usual in our webinars. That's great. That's good to know that our audience comes from different backgrounds and also different locations. All right, thank you so much for your patience. And now let's get started by properly introducing our guest speaker. Jason Potel is a visiting researcher in the psychology department at Goldsmiths, University of London, where he studies AI-generated misinformation and parasocial relationships with chatbots. He comes from a media background. He studied English, cinema, and photography with a strong focus on disinformation and media literacy. He recently received certification from the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute's Summer School on misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. And today he will be sharing insights gathered from his current PhD research. Welcome, Jason. I have always found the psychology behind why people believe and share misinformation and disinformation one of the most fascinating and also one of the most overlooked areas in the field. But right now, it seems more urgent than ever to understand it, because we are in a moment where AI-generated content makes it much harder to tell what's real and what's false. And it's also changing the rules of the game. So in today's presentation, I'm looking forward to learning about the different variables that shape these behaviors, and what I find especially interesting, how those factors can enable intense relationships with chatbots, which may also reinforce the disinformation cycle. So I'm really happy to hand over the floor to you to guide us through this complex and sometimes murky terrain. Over to you, Jason.
Amazing. Thank you, Raquel. Yeah, let me just share my screen to make sure. Oh, again, I have to send a request. Sorry. I think it just has to be quickly. There we go. Make sure. Let's see, of my PowerPoint. Oh, this is the presenter view. Sorry. Slideshow from the start. Okay, can people see that or no?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you,
That's
Jason.
good. Okay, if I switch my window or something, can you still see the slideshow or yeah?
Yes, yes.
Oh, great. Okay, then I'll get started. Um, well, thank you for coming and saying this is about AI generated misinformation. What types of people are most vulnerable to AI generated misinformation? You know, are you at risk of falling in love with a chatbot? Things like that. This talk offers a literature-based study on the role played by the psychological dispositions that help influence one's susceptibility to AI generated misinformation. And since Solomon Asch's post-war studies and conformity, psychologists have investigated individual susceptibility to faulty logic and bad information. And on the other side of the coin, significant research has been conducted in the efficacy of persuasion, which has recorded cognitive dissonance and measured behavioral change while observing a variety of factors, including the source of communication, the nature of what's being communicated, and the message's recipient, whose motivation, emotional state, and general psychology all determine whether or not they will accept new information. So, several studies have accommodated a multidimensional approach to take in account some or all of these variables. However, this webinar's focus on susceptibility to AI-generated misinformation specifically limits its scope to an analysis of the third category, that is, the recipients of AI-generated misinformation, which in today's media environment, a not insignificant percentage of the population encounters on a regular basis. This webinar has three primary goals. We're going to review the current research into which psychological dispositions are most susceptible to AI-generated misinformation and parasocial relationships with chatbots. I want to consider the contemporary approaches in mitigating susceptibility to AI-generated misinformation and parasocial relationships with chatbots. And then I want us to think about what areas of scholarship have yet to be covered. Hoax discourse has become increasingly in vogue over the last decade, illustrated by a sharp increase in academic publications on misinformation to the 2016 US presidential election and Brexit. And if we look beyond local impetuses, other researchers have identified various global lightning rods for fakery accusations, including climate change and COVID-19. The contemporary epistemic crisis has only been sorry, I lost my place. The contemporary epistemic crisis um, has only been exacerbated in the last 5 years with the emergence of large language models like OpenAI's ChatGPT, Anthropic's Claude, or Google's Gemini. Previous observations of institutional distrust have become all the more disconcerting as people increasingly bypass specialized expertise by deferring to a machine, albeit one exhibiting unprecedented mimetic sophistication. Canadian researchers have found that ChatGPT incorrectly endorsed statements up to 26% of the time, depending on the prompt. This has led many to encounter and accept misinformation, which may be harmful when applied, such as in the case of medical advice. More recently, trust in chatbots has accelerated beyond a source of knowledge to intense emotional companionship and as an introspective tool. And this trust in AI, not merely as a source of information, but as a source of personal affirmation, has become a particularly pressing issue of the moment. Misinformation can be especially harmful when it pertains to the user himself, or rather AI's filtered approximation of the user. Not only have some people invested trust in a chatbot's ability to quote unquote know them in some fundamental non-abstract way, but they also trust that these programs will be honest with what they know and not rely on equivocating responses designed to prioritize future engagement over general accuracy. There's already been multiple press reports of ChatGPT induced psychosis, in which the program's sycophancy has left users with delusions of grandeur. With the loneliness epidemic in full swing, the most susceptible to parasocial relationships with chatbots have gone as far as to declare their love for them and mistake the machine's responses as genuine reciprocation. The Eliza effect, or the subconscious tendency to project a degree of humanity on a text-based computer interface, dates back to the 1960s and the first wave of chatbots, but recent developments have intensified this phenomenon to disconcerting lengths, as demonstrated by one woman recently divorcing after confessing to an emotional affair with her AI. Disconcerting as these examples sound, they present best case scenarios of intervention. In other cases, however, these hallucinations result in much more significant consequences. In February 2025, a teenage boy with high functioning Asperger's died by suicide with his stepfather's gun in order to be united with a Game of Thrones themed chatbot persona he had fallen in love with on the website character.ai. 2 months later, a bipolar and schizophrenic man in Florida became convinced that OpenAI had murdered the persona he had been interfacing with, causing him to take up a knife and charge at police, who shot him. At least 11 murder or suicides in 2025 were linked with intensive personal communication with chatbots. And while these events and ensuing exposés have led to some positive reform, such as Character AI, the same Game of Thrones website, placing age restrictions to interface with the chatbots, these developments often function as one step forward and two steps back. You can look at Disney's landmark agreement with OpenAI, allowing its IP, its intellectual property, to be reproduced on Sora as of a couple months ago. And it's against this cultural backdrop that this webinar sits, by synthesizing much of the research concerning the psychological factors most susceptible to misinformation. I hope to not only help indicate what work we still have to do, but how this work can be used in a way that informs how we make policy about it, and approach online safety in general. When discussing terms like misinformation, trust, parasociality, it's important to be clear with definitions. Misinformation refers to false and untrue statements classified as factual knowledge. The terms typically distinguished from disinformation or false information created and spread purposefully to mislead. Bringing in questions of intent can prove particularly challenging when discussing artificial intelligence, somewhat of a technological black box, and the inner workings of LLMs are simultaneously driven and obscured by trademarked algorithms designed by teams of relatively anonymous engineers with their own individual ideologies, perspectives, and agendas. So I refer to AI-generated untrue content as misinformation and refrain from parsing out further nuances on the matter due to just the limited scope of this conversation. But experts have defined trust as both a coping mechanism and an evolutionary trait to survive a generally chaotic environment populated by unknowable factors. To trust is to invest in a potential outcome being true despite the possible alternative. This can be a general sentiment. I trust that the sun will rise tomorrow, even though it's yet to occur. When we trust that someone or something's generally reliable with the information they provide or with the information we give, we trust them. I trust my doctor because she's frequently honest. I trust my clock because it's always been accurate. Yeah. Looking at 40 peer-reviewed articles on human perceptions of chatbots, four central themes informed conceptualizations of trust. And those are user behavior and emotions, machine attributes, and situational context. And these definitions largely focused on competence, benevolence, and integrity. Multiple studies do not provide a clear definition of trust in this context, and the lack of standardization can be disconcerting given that a miscalculated trust in chatbots can escalate into parasocial relationships or a one-sided connection between someone and the object of their emotion. More than unreciprocated love, parasocial relationships consist of one party's sustained investment in a bond with another party who will not or cannot engage them back. This dynamic's not exclusively limited to chatbot engagement. Long before Claude, delusional celebrity and obsessions have motivated people to stalk and even kill public figures they believe to know personally. And the persistence in belief in a relationship that does not exist characterizes one of the major issues many face today online. Finally, given the focus on technological engagement, I should clarify some additional terminology. Artificial intelligence broadly describes the capability of non-human machines to perform, task solve, communicate, and act logically as it would occur to biological humans. And the definition covers significant ground, classifying everything from self-driving cars to Amazon product recommendations. So AI systems that are trained on a large corpus of text, which can produce human-generated input and respond in a way simulating humans, those are called large language models, or LLMs, and can be used for, again, a variety of purposes. But chatbots can best be understood as applications with built-in LLMs used primarily for conversational purposes. And these terms, misinformation, trust, parasocial relationships, artificial intelligence, and chatbots, they make up the central components of this webinar and this research. So psychology typically situates human processing within a theoretical framework of two systems. System one occurs instantaneously and is based in instinct and impulse and gut responses to stimuli, while system two describes slower, more intentional and analytical thinking. Accordingly, to stop and think about new information has become one of the most studied factors, in determining how we become susceptible to misleading content and unsound reasoning, whether online or offline. Research measures this skill using the cognitive reflection test often, or CRT, and various published studies have associated higher CRT scores with more accurate ability to discriminate true from false information. Work leading into COVID crucially found that the correlation between CRT and perceived accuracies unrelated to how closely the headline aligns with the participant's ideology, largely challenging motivated system two reasoning, which is a theory suggesting that cognitive deliberation can actually lead people to reject true or accept fake news after rationalizing this decision in accordance with their own ideological or political identities. Multiple studies have found that those with higher analytical thinking skills show greater discrimination ability and have identified no credible effect of ideological congruency on discrimination ability. So these general findings appear to hold true for both receiving and sharing of misinformation, and some have suggested that decreased cognitive reflection test performance among older adults might explain their significantly increased likelihood of sharing misinformation online. While intellect appears to have no significant impact on whether one trusts chatbots, one's level of knowledge does influence engagement. Trust may be hampered by one's own technological fluency or expertise in the topic on which the chatbot's providing information. Similarly, those who evaluate vulnerability risks, particularly concerning privacy, are less inclined to trust virtual assistant chatbots. But this relationship actually proves pretty complex because privacy cynicism counterintuitively appears to heighten one's trust in AI-enabled voice assistants, effectively functioning as a coping mechanism. And while some research has applied a cognitive lens, other studies look at it through an emotional one. And in addition to low critical thinking, emotional attachment to news predicts exposure to deep fakes and AI-generated misinformation, which in turn exacerbates antisocial behavior. This data theoretically intersects with that of the cognitive and analytical thinking, in that overly emotional individuals may struggle in suppressing system one thinking, which is a necessary step to employ the more deliberate system two thinking. And that said, it should be noted that not every emotion interferes with cognitive processing, and we can break it down into two groups, epistemic and non-epistemic emotions, which may allow for a more nuanced overview on how misinformation susceptibility works. Epistemic emotions are affective states that induce analytical engagement, such as when one feels surprised, determined, interested, and non-epistemic emotions correlate with increased belief in fake news and decreased veracity discernment, but epistemic emotions do not do that because they kind of jumpstart thinking and curiosity. Another classification is moral emotions, which can be broken into two categories: self-conscious and other condemning emotions. And this tend to generate more engagement. These are anger, contempt, and disgust, and dissemination of fake news or misinformation than self-conscious emotions like guilt and shame and pride. We don't like to share those things or read about them and believe them. Um, Difficulties in emotional regulation positively predicted belief in conspiracy theories and predicted dependence on emotion. Oh, and a dependence on emotion can increase one's belief in fake news. A German study found that parasociality contributes to deficient self-regulation, making chatbot use kind of a dependence. It promotes use in the chatbot because we lose all ability to self-regulate. We start to artificially regulate our emotions, our mood, and that becomes a self-fulfilling cycle of just continuously depending on chatbots, especially for lonely users, creating a dependence with addiction-like side effects. Sorry. Oh, good. The Sorry, I lost my place again. Alongside metacognition and emotional-based analysis, there's been a lot of research prioritizing personality as one of the most studied psychological detriments of misinformation susceptibility. We accept and employ a bunch of different frameworks and metrics to conceptualize and measure personality attributes, but one standard is the big five: open-mindedness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And one study found that greater levels of agreeableness and conscientiousness and open-mindedness and lower levels of extroversion and fewer hours of news consumption were related to better news discernment. A review in 2024 showed that more extroverted, less conscientious, and less agreeable people tend to be more susceptible to believing in and sharing misinformation, while some have claimed that the sharing of fake news is largely driven by low conscientiousness, in addition to political factors. That is not a great claim because high conscientious individuals tend to share less information in general, and so they don't have any indication of having a particularly great filtering mechanism for discerning veracity. And so it's kind of a red herring. But multiple studies on internet scams indicated that high extroversion and low openness correlated with scam compliance, and openness predicted ignoring and deleting phishing emails. One study on AI-based voice assistants associates both conscientiousness and agreeableness with trust, while another identified that extroversion and agreeableness were the most impactful personality traits in regard to trusting chatbots. The impact of an individual's worldview on his or her risk of believing or sharing misinformation remains the subject of debate among a lot of scholars. And while some have noted that political ideology lacks significant impact on the correlation between analytical thinking and discernment ability, participants were more inclined to judge news headlines as true if they aligned with their ideological stance. Individuals more prone to intuitive rather than analytical thinking prove more likely to defer to political bias. And thus, some have viewed this bias as radical tribal loyalty, but it's just as easy to assume that the results come from an insulated nature of today's informational ecosystem and something much less, deliberate. And individuals often receive, two different sets of facts depending on the media subscription. So it could just also be attributed to that. But political views correlate with intense emotional reaction to news, whether true or false. And that, as previously discussed, can help determine how one classifies new information. So we do know that some background of political knowledge, regardless of affiliation, does appear to help individuals recognize misinformation with better accuracy, and participants were better at discerning false news, truth from falsehood when judging politically concordant news compared with politically discordant news, against their political ideology. Um, Multiple international studies have identified political conservatives as particularly susceptible to misinformation. Yet again, more work needs to be done here. If political ideology does play a defining role in how people choose to process new information, it appears to be determined more by the level of extremity than partisan preference, with one study reporting that conspiracy mentalities associated with extreme left and especially extreme right-wing beliefs, a finding exacerbated when one identifies with the party not in power. All of that gets heightened. Similarly, a French study found that compared with people at the center of the political spectrum, those at the extremes, left or right, were more likely to believe that the COVID-19 virus was created in a lab. While not necessarily a political stance, perception of and trust in technology and the companies that manufacture it had a positive association with trust in chatbots. Um, Psychologists have conducted considerable research into how mental illness can alter one's ability to process information appropriately. In two different experiments, researchers found that individuals suffering from depression were just as, if not more, capable of discerning misinformation compared to the control group. So next time you're feeling depressed, it's actually a flex. Similar findings show that negative moods have an overall beneficial influence on reducing gullibility and increasing skepticism. And while less research has been conducted on chronic anxiety disorders, multiple studies have positively associated situational anxiety with misinformation and acceptance and trust in chatbots. So in one study, job anxiety specifically moderated the relationship between ChatGPT's users, the user perceptions and the psychological well-being. In another survey, people with higher levels of autistic traits were shown to be more likely to endorse conspiracy theories and misinformation. Specific autistic traits, including a higher attention to detail and lower ability to employ one's imagination, showed a direct correlation with misinformation and conspiracy theory engagement. While autism positively predicted self-reporting of false information, it actually didn't. It did not negatively affect veracity discernment. It actually improved veracity discernment, being able to tell true from false, among individuals high in schizotypy, who otherwise were associated with poor veracity discernment. And this condition had a direct effect on both sharing false information and in a survey of nearly 1,500 people of the public, it predicted poor discernment of misinformation, as well as paranoia and histrionic symptoms. All of that predicts poor discernment of misinformation. Individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia exhibited an increased susceptibility to go along with misleading suggestive items. And in a study of 120 participants, paranoid ideation strongly correlated with belief in conspiracy theories. They also showed an increased tendency to change answers under conditions of social pressure. Um, so research into in addition to mental illness, neurodivergence, and psychosis. Research has tested what effect antisocial characteristics may have on one's engagement with the misinformation. All three dark triad traits, narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism, showed a positive correlation with sharing misinformation, with two of them, narcissism and psychopathy, associated with greater belief in misinformation. And in samples correlated from 4 different countries, 3 exhibited a correlation between narcissism and conspiracy mentality. Using the misinformation susceptibility test, MIST, one study identified associations between higher Machiavellianism and a stronger belief in misinformation, a greater tendency to defer to cognitive biases, and a greater likelihood of sharing false information. Psychopathic traits weren't related to accuracy, but those high in psychopathic traits tend to incorporate more misinformation into memory. Research into the PID5, maladaptive personality traits, negative affectivity, detachment, antagonism, disinhibition, and psychotism associated antagonism with the ability to deceive, but not with the ability to detect deception. According to an online survey, PID5 facets of unusual beliefs and experiences, as well as suspiciousness, significantly predicted belief in conspiracy theories. Similarly, in another survey, individuals with higher levels of impulsivity and suspiciousness were more likely to believe misinformation. A constellation of identity demographics interplays with all the psychological variables in myriad ways. Age, for example, confounds the impact of cognitive reflection over truth discernment. Individuals only exhibit this positive correlation between cognitive reflection and true, being able to tell what's true after childhood, and often decline in cognitive reflection test, CRT ability, in late adulthood. Several studies have identified age's negative correlation with conspiracy theory susceptibility. An apparent naivete renders younger demographics more gullible to misleading scams, particularly in the online domain, like phishing attacks. That said, like emotion, psychology remains far from a consensus regarding the role of age, which may prove particularly challenging to track due to a potential lack of linear modeling. And while some have observed phishing susceptibility in younger participants, numerous studies have identified older adults as the group most at risk of phishing attempts, spam emails, and other acts of deception, resulting in them sharing misinformation at almost 7 times the rate that young adults do, potentially due to other trends like declining cognitive function, like I said, and increased entrenched political identification, which happens as you might get older. And other experiments have undermined these findings, suggesting that older adults may be the most apt in resisting misinformation. For example, a meta-analysis aggregating studies across a 35-year period demonstrated a positive relationship between education and knowledge. Given that multiple studies into age's impact on misinformation measures education levels, it may be necessary to consider how class shapes much of this data. A population-based survey conducted on over 5,000 Hong Kong residents found that participants of low socioeconomic status gave a higher level of endorsement of misinformation. In a Chinese online survey, individuals with higher socioeconomic status, or SES, were less likely to accept health misinformation compared to those from lower socioeconomic groups. A Liberian survey indicated that misinformed individuals weren't any poorer, older, less educated, more economically distressed, more rural, or ethnically different than more informed individuals. And in another survey, participants in high economic inequality experienced higher levels of conspiracy beliefs. This suggests that susceptibility and misinformation gap exists less between the rich versus the poor, and more between those in conditions with versus without economic disparities in general. A subject of contention, analyses into the role of gender in misinformation susceptibility has yielded inconclusive results and contradicting results. Some publications have identified women as particularly at risk for believing and sharing misinformation, while other studies have designated men as the most likely party to be endorsing conspiracy theories. While there's less research in regard to trust in LLMs, a Norwegian survey of 2,700 people found that women demonstrated more hesitance to trusting chatbots. Multiple surveys targeting the patronage of Replica and other companion bots found that the majority tend to be male. And in an international survey, the South Asian women demonstrated particular distrust in chatbot AI systems. Different regional cultures have shown different levels of vulnerability to personal investment in relationships with LLMs. East Asian participants show considerably more willingness to socialize with LLMs than European and United States counterparts, according to research. Susceptibility to misinformation is often associated with illogical or unprovable belief systems. And one study in India associated religious individuals with higher levels of misinformation endorsement. Multiple studies have shown that religious fundamentalists are more likely to believe false news. An Australian survey similarly identified that individuals who attach importance to their religious belief demonstrated a higher belief in conspiracy theories, and in a survey of over 1,000 German adults, a literal interpretation of religious texts and teachings had a positive relation with belief in specific conspiracy theories. And white evangelicals are particularly known to be vectors for politicized misinformation in studies. But when reappropriated, studies actually show that religious framing can also render corrections and retractions more effective than standard interventional methods as a potential treatment. And I'll discuss potential treatments in a second. For spirit, oops. There we go. For spiritual beliefs, like narcissism and a lack of analytical thinking, spirituality predicts conspiratorial beliefs. Moreover, believers in paranormal things explicitly overlap with conspiracy theorists and pseudoscientists. Numerous reports have associated paranormal belief systems with susceptibility to the conjunction fallacy, which dictates that the more detailed something, a theory, an account, something, the more detailed it is, the more believable it becomes, regardless of actual truth status. A study consisting of responses from 238 participants associated belief in AI predictions with belief in astrology, suggesting that non-rational factors like superstitious thinking significantly influence how individuals engage with AI systems. Individuals who overclaim their knowledge struggle with veracity discernment, potentially because they rely on system one, intuitive, non-analytical thinking, despite perceiving themselves as being system two heavy thinkers. For example, financial egocentrism exhibits correlations with fraud susceptibility. Perception of oneself is measured by various metrics. Multiple studies have analyzed self-efficacy's role, which has been shown to affect one's likelihood of being a victim of instant messaging and phishing scams. High self-efficacy has led to negative attitudes among internet users and thereby mitigates phishing attempts. In a New Zealand study measuring participants' fulfillment of four psychological needs: belonging, control, meaning in life, and self-esteem, those whose core needs are less satisfied tend to exhibit higher levels of conspiracy belief across time. Taken all together, it appears that individuals may require some sense of self to resist misinformation, but risk diminishing, if not detrimental returns should it achieve like a critical mass, crossing the Rubicon into pompousness, and then you become overclaiming of your confidence, which can be bad. Individuals with low self-esteem are also more likely to conduct problematic behavior when engaging AI chatbots, with secondary factors like anxiety and involuntary avoidance further mediating interaction. Individuals with positive perceptions of beliefs pertaining to ChatGPT may experience increased self-esteem, but trust in chatbots can lead to psychological dependence, yielding salience, tolerance, and withdrawal, which are markers, again, of addiction. There remains significant work to be done to better understand how people process information, and this will be a crucial step in formulating how best to mitigate susceptibility to AI-generated misinformation. To begin, a significant portion of misinformation studies function in the abstract rather than specifically within the parameters of online activity, such as social media algorithms and clickbait. Of this research, only a fraction test human engagement with artificial intelligence, of which only a minority is dedicated to trust in LLMs and chatbots. And this provides insufficient. This is insufficient in light of recent developments laid out at the start of this webinar, which has rendered "quote unquote" chatbot induced psychosis, certainly not a clinical use term, but something the press has been using, one of the most pressing forms of misinformation susceptibility today. Even in the groundbreaking studies into misinformation writ large conducted so far, there have been excluded a lot of variables and theoretical frameworks warranting proper testing. Several concepts, including social identity theory, rational choice theory, social comparison theory, and self-determination theory, have yet to be introduced into the discourse. This gap thus warrants additional quantitative and longitudinal studies that incorporate inventories from relevant frameworks to identify potential correlations with trust in misinformation, AI, and the responses it gives us. These constructs measuring self-worth and socialization may prove just as crucial in understanding parasocial relationships with applications using LLMs. Factors like anxiety, the need for companionship, and especially loneliness influence how users engage with AI chatbots. Questions of how and why we form these connections may lead us to a better understand what people gain and lose from them and how best to mitigate risk of unknowingly consuming misinformation as a byproduct. Really quickly, that high susceptibility to misinformation is certainly not a death sentence. There's been various tested approaches to reshaping one's engagement, each bringing its own benefits and issues, building off of psychologist William McGuire's inoculation theory. Psychologists at the University of Cambridge have spent years developing methods for pre-bunking by equipping media users with the cognitive tools needed to discern real from fake information. Their bad news app gamifies the pre-bunking experience by allowing users to play the part of the conspiracy theory creator to teach them the rhetorical clues to better detect misinformation. Vulnerability to false conspiracy theory narratives decreased 20% among those who played it. Pre-bunking is ultimately limited to preventative care and thus unideal for treating someone already subscribed to a conspiracy theory. Ironically, AI has been proven itself to be surprisingly powerful tool in combating pre-existing dangerous conspiracy theory belief systems, because fighting fire with fire in a 2024 study out of MIT, trained AI chatbots were used to dissuade participants out of their preconceived conspiracy theories. And the experiment decreased the average participant's belief in his or her respective conspiracy theory by 20%. Results lasted for at least 2 months and proved successful across various different misinformed conspiracy theories without diminishing belief in actual conspiracies. And so just to summarize, first, what research already exists regarding dispositions most susceptible to AI-generated misinformation and parasocial relationships to chatbots? Lots. Significant literature has shown us that there's been a lot of work done determining factors like cognitive abilities, personality traits, political ideology, spiritual beliefs, emotional state, and socioeconomic standing among users. And other factors. Second, what contemporary interventions are currently being conceptualized to mitigate susceptibility to AI-generated misinformation? This has shown us that pre-bunking is a big thing, and the gamification of media literacy, as I just explained, as well as the reappropriation of chatbot engagement to guide users out of preconceived conspiracy theories rather than indoctrinating them into new ones. And finally, what areas of scholarship have yet to be adequately considered? Given the significant discourse over the last decade concerning increased feelings of isolation and loneliness, looking at this could prove to be a crucial influence over how humans engage with AI LLMs. In addition to replicating trials of already conducted experiments to confirm their findings, we need to incorporate hitherto unemployed but relevant metrics and theoretical frameworks like self-determination, which measures one's sense of autonomy, their competence, their sense of being and relatedness. And only by doing that, I think, will we really get to like the nut of what the problem is. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason, for this inspiring presentation. You really brought a new angle here. And now it's time to start the Q&A session. As a reminder, please use the QR code to join Slido or type slido.com #disinfo. We have around 15 minutes for questions. And at this moment, we are 60 people in the room. Yeah, a good crowd. We have already some questions on Slido. Please vote for the ones you would like to be answered first. I'm going to give the first one because, Jason, I recently read a research saying that small false details introduced in chatbots conversations can lead to longer lasting and more vivid false memories. And I found this very, very interesting. So based on your work on parasocial relationships with chatbots, do you think that this relational trust can make these inaccuracies not just more persuasive, but also more persistent over time?
I saw that study, and it is interesting because a lot of commentary on, I think, the use of chatbots like ChatGPT or Claude or whatever over the last year has been talking about. There's been a lot of think pieces in like the New Yorker about like my chatbot's my therapist and that's okay or something. But we have to remember like bad therapy is so dangerous, and I mean, there was like a wave of a false memory hysteria of or panic that happened in human therapy decades ago, and it created chaos and gave therapy a bad name, and measures had to be taken institutionally for it. And so but a chatbot doesn't know any of that because it was just programmed and doesn't take that into account, and it is programmed to affirm in a way that no human therapist is really programmed. And so it's interesting, this psychosis, this false memory thing. It does seem to have almost the symptoms of like a very bad therapist who's kind of fishing for like a certain form of engagement.
Mhm. Thank you so much. Let's move now on to questions from the audience. We have one very short and very direct one. Believing in conspiracy theories increase dopamine?
Believing in conspiracy theories increases dopamine.
Yeah.
Yes, not really. I mean, sure, yeah, I agree. I don't, I know there's studies for that, and that the question I don't think is conspiracy theory epistemology pleasurable, or do people enjoy believing fringe or debunked worldviews? Because I don't know if it really gets us to the question of how to mitigate and facilitate that. Do we make it less fun? Or I don't know how you would inhibit the dopamine release of believing in something you're not supposed to, that also relieves you. I mean, this is why I think self-confidence is such a large factor of whether you believe conspiracy theories, because it can also, part of that dopamine rush can be because you're justifying a certain status quo that maybe you feel needs to be retroactively justified or revised under some conditions. And so I don't know if there's a way to undo that. But I think that, I don't know, maybe we can make believing in real facts just as exhilarating and dopamine releasing.
That's
We'll
a
see.
good
Yeah.
idea. I would like to bring up this one as well because it sounds very interesting. If mental health conditions can increase vulnerability to disinfo, what does that mean for clinical practice? Should clinicians screen for misinformation exposure or chatbot dependence? Or what interventions or safeguards can reduce risk?
Oh, I definitely think modern mental health clinicians need to incorporate a lot of these concerns and front of mind in a way that they haven't had to, in the sense of like, are they, some of the really unfortunate suicides of last year, that where people were speaking really in depth with their preferred chatbot, their therapist knew about it, and my patient is tells me that when they're not in session with me, all they do is talk to this chatbot. And um I mean, there's only so much anyone can do in any situation, and I should really preface this while saying, like, I don't work in clinical practitioner therapy. All of this is research. I'm not myself a therapist, but I do think that it is vital, especially if a therapist patient is exhibiting symptoms of mental distress, poor mental health, maybe some psychosis or delusion, to check in with like how they're receiving their information and who they're engaging with online.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We have another question from Leticia. Is there evidence that scams and disinformation are processed differently at a cognitive or emotional level? And do these two vulnerabilities generally correlate beyond age?
The there are the cognitive and the emotional ways. I'm just trying to make sure I understand the question. The question is it that people process scams and disinformation in different ways, or people process scams and disinformation in cognitive and emotional ways? The cognitive and emotional thing, I think, really interacts with each other because, as I was saying, bringing it back to like very basic understanding of psychology is just, the system one, system two, that, we have an impulsivity of an immediate thought that we can respond to our world with, and we have system two and analytical, are the sorts of responses we have if we are deliberate and conscious about it. But if you have high emotional attachment in news or information, or the context of a scam, if you're put in a high emotional state, you will think impulsively, you will not think consciously, and your ability to discern truth will go down. And that is why a lot of studies have shown that misinformation has consciously triggers emotion, because they know that will activate um, a more immediate response, and that a more immediate response will be less calculated.
Thank you. Next one. In an era of deepfakes and AI, is critical thinking becoming a liability? If we teach everyone to question everything, don't we just end up with a society of nihilists who believe nothing?
Yeah,
Just in case.
that's really interesting, and something that I think about a lot, because I had done my PhD was more on news misinformation and broadcast journalism, and this work is obviously much more about on digital communication. And there is a lot of very easily are like, if you and I don't think the answer is like, well, you have to teach like a blanket skepticism or to people who are too open-minded, or people who refuse to accept true headlines. You have to teach a blanket openness, because that would never work. I mean, that no one's, I don't think anyone is prescribing that. And I think that impressively, the MIT report on their work using AI to what's the antonym, into indoctrinate people, to undo that, has found that it didn't deter actual it didn't stop people from believing in actual conspiracies, because conspiracies happen, coups happen. It's what, like, conspiracy is not a dirty word in itself. But the ones that were fake, it was able to kind of, through being programmed a certain way, prompt people to question the fake ones, the ones that have no standing, the one that has no material backing whatsoever, or legal case or anything. And so I do think we have to be careful of these sort of like, we should treat everything cynically, or treat I don't know. It's a nuanced conversation, and anything else is a little bit lazy. It's just like, we just have to be, real about what's the most productive way to tackle this.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is a misunderstanding when we try to promote critical thinking. We always receive this kind of responses, and yeah, I think it's actually the most dangerous thing that can happen in our field, is that people believe in nothing, because if you believe nothing, you can believe in everything at the same time. So yeah, this is maybe more a philosophical question more than psychological, right? We have another one focused on interventions and related to the religion and spiritual aspect you brought
Yeah.
up. If certain religious or spiritual profiles are associated with higher vulnerability to disinformation, what does that imply for effective interventions? partnering with faith leaders, for instance, and that's a great point, community-based pre-banking, or tailored media literacy approaches?
That is a good question. I mean, if you notice someone has any of these dispositions that would make them more susceptible to misinformation, pre-bunking is good at teaching media literacy and just, can be you can bunk, you can pre-bunk specific things, but you can also, yeah, teach media literacy approaches, which is a good idea. I think that it is similar to the political thing where there's plenty of research that can point to any like one ideology and say like that's the ideology that causes conspiracy thinking. But what really shows the least amount of illogical thinking is people who are not that extreme on either side. And in religion, I don't think the goal isn't to make someone like a fervent atheist because um, because in the study that showed people who do not hold much emotional attachment or don't who do not hold a much important attachment to their religious beliefs were less likely to fall for fake information. That included people who were not religious at all. But if you attached a lot of like, if you were like a really proud atheist, you were probably more susceptible to misinformation than someone who is not has no identity marking sort of attachment to these belief systems. And so again, like you were just on talk of intervention, teaching media literacy, pre-bunking, but also a lot of this is not to like show your conservative friends or show your religious friends or show your any sort of Americans fall for misinformation all the time, to be like, look at these statistics, because a lot of it is just more about like how can we find less extreme, more nuanced ways of thinking and instead of trying to bring anybody to an opposite, inverse position.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I will take the very last one because we are running out of time. So, is it possible that spreading disinfo is a rational choice for some? If a lie strengthens your community and hurts your enemies, hasn't the person won in terms of evolutionary survival?
That using disinformation is almost an evolutionary trait, are you saying, to survive? And that it's interesting counter argument. Yeah, it is, and it's again, it's something that I think there's a lot of arguments for disinformation in this conversation, specific disinformation with a D. I know I was using misinformation a lot, but there's a lot of scholars and uh, academics at English universities all over Europe that talk about platform size, and you kind of hit a terminal velocity or something of that eventually your responsibility means that even if you didn't mean it to be wrong, it's disinformation because your platform deserves more responsibility than it's disinformation by negligence. And I think that we're seeing that a lot on a large institutional systematic sort of scale by deploying this sort of technology online. But yeah, it's also maybe a survival instinct, who's to say?
Yeah, if I may add something, yeah, I think spreading disinformation is always or almost always a rational choice because the intention is there. So the intention to deceive. So yeah, okay. I'm so sorry we don't have any more time. Thank you again, Jason, for this exciting discussion and for addressing all the questions or almost all the questions. As usual, we would love to hear your opinion on the session. So please fill in a rating survey after the webinar ends. And before wrapping up, a quick reminder that the session will be available shortly on our YouTube channel, probably tomorrow. And that we will host more webinars this February. Next Thursday, we will host Jeremy Henry from DigiClima and Stephanie Hankey from Tactical Tech in the session Scroll, Stop, Verify, how the EU is bringing climate facts forward. And in 2 weeks, we will have Forced to Quit, Gender Disinformation, Synthetic Abuse and Political Violence with Marilia Gerke from the University of Groningen. Thank you again, our speaker, and thank you, Anna, our support in the background, and thank you to everyone who attended. Have a nice rest of the day, and we hope to keep seeing you around. Goodbye.
Thank you.